Who defends the Constitution when somebody challenges its authority? For more than 200 years, our courts and the judges, juries, and lawyers who serve justice every day have protected American freedoms by upholding the Constitution as the highest law in the land. America won't work without fair and impartial courts. State Bar of Georgia, lawyers dedicated to the Constitution's promise of justice for all.
Leave your legal question for us on our toll-free law line at 888-203-7-LAW.
And we're back with more Talking Law TV. In this segment, Gene Brooks is here talking about mesothelioma and asbestosis. Hi, Gene.
Hey, Michael. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. We're here to talk about asbestosis and mesothelioma, and I know that you're a medically sort of inclined guy. We have some slides to start off with about exactly what it is and what it does to your lungs.
Okay, yeah. You got here a diagram of some lungs, and you can see off to the left, or closer to you, there's a little word there that says pleura, P-L-U-E-U-R-A, and that is the lining of the lungs, and that is where the cancer called mesothelioma begins. And it's a fatal cancer, and it's caused almost universally by asbestos. And
then we have an actual X-ray here.
Okay, yeah, it looks like there's a lung missing on one side, but lung X-rays are good to diagnose a fibrosis in the lungs, and that is what asbestosis is. It's a fibrosis. It's just one of a number of occupationally created fibers or dust fibers that can cause a fibrosis in the lungs.
I'm surprised it's still around, because aren't most of the causes of this outdated and not used anymore?
Well, yeah, the product is not being used much anymore, but it was used up until the 1970s, up to the end of the 1970s. And so a lot of the people who were exposed in the late 1970s are even now just developing mesotheliomas and asbestosis, because there's a latency period of, it can be as long as 40 years.
Wow. And we have a list here we can put on screen that talks about what some of those people perhaps did for a living.
Yeah. You have a lot of people who were exposed in the construction trades. Here's the insulators, obviously those who worked with insulation, with asbestos insulation, but also those who would go in and remove the asbestos insulation to apply another type of insulation. So they were exposed up until the late 1970s. Industrial maintenance. Sometimes the asbestos was put in a plant, but was not removed until, say, the 80s, or maybe in the 90s, when the industries went through an abatement process. And so when that abatement occurred, there could also have been exposure to asbestos, and to varying degrees. And this asbestosis usually requires a pretty heavy exposure to asbestos fibers, unlike mesothelioma. Mesothelioma can it can involve a very low amount of exposure. It's like a Steve McQueen. I think he worked around brakes, and he got mesothelioma. You know, and we see that also for people who were, say, the children of industrial workers, of people who worked around asbestos. They would come home, and in that instance, the children or the spouses could have been exposed to the asbestos. Now, mesothelioma is just one type of cancer. You can also have actual lung cancer from the asbestos, and that usually develops after somebody has developed
we have a second list that was just up about the other kinds of workers, and so as you mentioned, Steve McQueen with brake pad dust, auto mechanics, semi-truck, aircraft, because you know those big air jets that are serviced so much, they go through pads on a weekly basis.
Okay, well,
and railroad workers, and you've seen the trucks under a train. It's nothing but brakes, basically.
Right, and now they're removing a lot of the asbestos from the brakes now, and you hear complaints from people who say, well, that's why the brakes squealed. But it's better than the alternative, at least for the guys who are working with the brakes. And there again, that is a continuing source of litigation, and a lot of the brake pad manufacturers are still around.
What does it actually do to your lung inside?
Well, the fibers are cannot be broken down by the body. Like, we inhale stuff all the time that our lungs are able to dispose of. They'll take it through the lymph system and excrete it. But asbestos fibers get stuck. And they're really the ones that the smallest ones, the ones you can't see are the most dangerous because they're called aerosols and they can go deep into the lungs. And so the body starts to react to those after a while, and you get a little inflammation process going. And after about, it could be 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, that all becomes fibrous instead of being very supple, where you got the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide going through the tissues, very thin tissues, that all hardens up. And so the patient with asbestosis actually begins to suffocate. He's not getting the oxygen that he needs.
So instead of being spongy material, it's just literally hard.
Yeah, it becomes very fibrous.
And you already mentioned it's always fatal.
Well, that's I was speaking of mesothelioma. Asbestosis you can live with. People can be put on oxygen. And like an emphysema is a lung injury people get from smoking. And you'll see them also on oxygen. But asbestosis and occupational dust injuries, lung dust injuries, are different, but the treatment's the same, just trying to get oxygen in the person.
How much exposure does it take to come down with either of these?
Well, asbestosis can be some pretty heavy exposure. The insulators or people working in construction. But with mesothelioma, it's not. You can just have just a little bit of exposure. And that's one reason it's such a public health issue even now. And they're still doing studies on that. And for instance, maybe schools with asbestos product in them. And the reason that's a concern is because of mesothelioma.
Okay, can you still file cases? Or is this like a product liability case with a statute of limitations on it?
No, you can file within 2 years from the date of your diagnosis. The big issue now is whether the asbestos manufacturer is still in business. That may not be an issue if, for instance, there's a plant owner involved. If there's a family member who was injured as a result of their father coming home with asbestos dust, then the child who's now grown and now has the cancer could bring suit against the premise owner that allowed the asbestos to come home, the industry owner, whoever owned the plant. But a lot of the companies like Johns Manville, for instance, which was just egregious evidence against Johns Manville for what they knew and what they were allowing to happen, had gone into bankruptcy and had bankruptcy protection. But there's still a settlement trust that's been set aside that they're funding for settlement of claims.
Now, you said premises owner. If I owned a building that was used by a company that did brake work, could they come after the owner of the real estate as well as the owner of the business?
If the person with the real estate knew what was going on, you have to show, in Georgia, you have to show superior knowledge to the person who's injured. In other words, if there was a person who was injured, they would have to show that the premise owner, and if it was you in that case, had superior knowledge to the dangers of asbestos than they did.
Wow. And you've practiced this quite a bit and done a lot of cases.
Yeah, we started, well, when I first started in the early 80s, we started practicing, doing asbestos work, going to all these deposits. That's when the manufacturers were mostly still around.
And now you see when they're cleaning out these buildings, everyone's like in a spacesuit.
That's right, yeah, and that's when they do the abatement. Everything's becoming much more restrictive now.
Okay, well, if you have any questions about this or any other subject you'd like to talk to Gene about, you can reach them through our TV show's website at talkinglawtv.com or call on our toll-free number at 888-203-7-LAW, and we'll be back meeting Charles Ryle right after this. Stay tuned.
Thanks for watching Talking Law TV. We feature the area's leading local attorneys, recent court rulings, and laws that can affect your daily lives. That's why we say legal news you can use. Coming soon, Talking Law TV's producers will be bringing another news magazine program to WSAV. For Your Health TV, a news magazine show featuring the Coastal Empire's leading health and wellness professionals. For more info about the show, visit the website at foryourhealthtv.com. And thanks for watching.
Have a legal issue? Visit TalkingLawTV.com and leave your question. It may be used on the show.